Welcome back to my channel, where we uncover the forgotten corners of the past. Today, I'm taking you into a story about a family that vanished on a road trip in 1992 and the locked metal box discovered in an attic 32 years later that you might have never heard before. A mystery buried in the dust of time. A truth that will send shivers down your spine. But before we embark on this journey, take a moment to let me know where are you listening to this story from. That helps me understand how far these secrets have traveled. And if this story truly captivates you, if it makes you ponder, don't hesitate to give me a like and subscribe to the channel to keep me going. Together, we'll explore the darkest pages of history, and you won't want to miss a thing. The summer heat of 2024 pressed against the windows of the old Victorian house on Maple Street. A silent, suffocating weight inside. The air was thick with the musty scent of old wood and forgotten things. A fragrance that clung to the very fabric of time, as if the house itself were exhaling the sorrows of a century. For Sarah Mitchell, each step of the creaking wooden stairs to the attic was a journey deeper into the past, not just of the house, but of her own fractured life. At 38, she had spent the better part of 3 weeks sorting through the vestiges of her late grandmother's existence, a task that felt less like an act of remembrance and more like an archaeological dig into layers of accumulated memory and unspoken sorrow. She paused halfway up the stairs, her hand resting on the smooth, worn banister. Remembering how Elelanina used to say the house had good bones but a sad heart, Sarah had never understood what that meant. Until now, this was supposed to be the last time, the final clearing before the house was listed for sale, before this last tangible link to her past was severed forever. The weight of grief, still raw a month after Elelanina Wells had passed away peacefully in her sleep, sat heavy on her shoulders. It was a grief compounded by the overwhelming burden of deciding what to keep and what to let go from a life that spanned 91 years. Elelanina had been more than a grandmother to Sarah. She had been a creator of worlds, the architect of a fragile peace built upon a foundation of secrets. She had been the anchor in the storm, the constant star in a sky emptied of its constellations when Sarah was just 6 years old. The attic was stifling, a tomb of forgotten dreams where the heat was a physical presence. Dust motes danced like frantic spirits in the shafts of afternoon sunlight filtering through a small circular window, illuminating a landscape of shrouded furniture and stacked boxes that looked like sleeping giants. Sarah had been methodical, a surgeon dissecting a life, before tackling the large trunk. Her hands brushed across a smaller cardboard box labeled School Days. Inside, beneath yellowed report cards, she found a child's drawing of a stick figure family under a smiling sun. In the corner, in clumsy, backward letters, was the name Emma, her sister. A sudden, sharp memory pierced through the fog of time. Emma, reading to her in a shared bed, her voice a soft murmur, the scent of lavender from her pillow. The memory was so vivid it was painful. A phantom limb of a life she barely knew. She set the drawing aside, her throat tight, and turned to the heavy wooden trunk. As its timber groaned in protest, she noticed it, an anomaly, a subtle imperfection in the otherwise uniform floorboards beneath. One section seemed slightly raised, a subtle buckle in the wood, as if it had warped over time, swollen with the humidity of countless Iowa summers. Curiosity, a flicker of instinct against the tide of exhaustion, compelled her to kneel. The floorboards were warm to the touch. Her fingers traced the edges of the board, feeling for a splinter, a nail, anything that might explain the imperfection. What she discovered made her heart race. A sudden, frantic staccato against the oppressive silence of the house. The boards weren't warped at all. They were loose, cut with a precision that belied any natural cause. They formed a makeshift lid, a deliberate concealment that had lain hidden for decades, patiently waiting beneath the weight of forgotten history. With hands that trembled, not from effort, but from a sudden, inexplicable dread, she carefully pried them up. The cavity beneath was small, dark, and breathed a puff of cool, cellar-like air that smelled of earth and secrets. And nestled within it was a metal lockbox, roughly the size of a shoebox. Its surface, once painted green, was now a mottled landscape of chipped paint and dulled steel, veiled in a fine layer of dust that seemed ancient. As she lifted it out, its weight surprised her, a solid, dense object that felt far heavier than its size suggested. It was the weight of secrets, of words unsaid and truths unspoken. There was no key, but the lock was old, a relic from a time when secrets were perhaps easier to keep. In that moment, standing in the suffocating heat of the attic, Sarah Mitchell understood with chilling certainty that this was not a forgotten keepsake. This was a buried truth, a deliberate act of concealment by the one person she had trusted above all others. This house, this town of Cedar Falls, Iowa, had always excelled at keeping secrets on the surface. It was the picture of Midwestern tranquility, a place of manicured lawns and quiet streets where life flowed with a gentle, predictable rhythm. But beneath that placid veneer, the town carried a scar, a collective wound that for 32 years had never truly healed. It was a void, a hollow echo in the town's memory, known simply as the Mitchell disappearance. In the summer of 1992, an entire family, a father, David, a mother, Rebecca, and their eldest daughter, Emma, had driven away on a road trip and simply vanished from the face of the earth. They left behind only a 6-year-old girl, an abandoned car on a desolate stretch of Interstate 80, and a question that hung in the air like a permanent, low-lying fog. The town had grieved. It had whispered. It had theorized in hushed tones over coffee at the local diner. But eventually, as towns do, it had moved on, encasing the tragedy in the amber of local folklore. The mystery became a cautionary tale told to children, its sharp edges worn smooth by the passage of time. Yet, for Sarah, there was no moving on, and for her grandmother, Elena, this house had become a mausoleum of memory, a sanctuary dedicated to a loss so profound it defied words. Every room was a testament to the family that was gone. Photographs lined the mantelpiece, their smiling faces frozen in a time before the great vanishing, a gallery of ghosts. Her father's favorite armchair still sat by the fireplace, an indentation still visible in the worn leather. Her mother's gardening tools still hung, cleaned and oiled, in the shed. It was a home where the clocks had stopped in 1992, preserved not by dust, but by a love so fierce it bordered on obsession. Elena had curated this quiet, sorrowful museum, all while raising Sarah within its walls, protecting her from the ghosts that lingered in every corner. Sarah carried the cold, heavy box downstairs, the usual creaks of the house sounding different now, like watchful whispers. In the familiar comfort of the kitchen, she placed the box on the table and for a long moment simply stared at it. A wave of doubt washed over her. Maybe she should leave it. Maybe she should take it to the river and throw it in, letting its secrets sink into the mud. Her grandmother had built a life for her, a good life, a peaceful one. What right did she have to shatter that peace now? But the face of the little girl in Emma's drawing flashed in her mind. She deserved to know. She set her jaw and reached for the screwdriver. The struggle with the lock was arduous. The metal screeched in protest as she worked the tool into the mechanism, her knuckles white with effort. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, There was a sharp, metallic click that seemed to echo through the silent house like a gunshot. The lid creaked open, releasing a faint, dry scent of old paper and time itself. The first thing she saw was not gold, not jewels, not the mementos of a lost love. It was a manila envelope, yellowed and brittle with age, and written across it, in her grandmother's distinctive, elegant handwriting, was a single word that made the air leave her lungs in a painful rush. Sarah. Her name, a message intended only for her, sent from beyond the grave. With hands that shook from a mixture of anticipation and a dread so profound it felt like ice in her veins. She lifted the envelope. It was surprisingly thick. Beneath it lay a collection of newspaper clippings, their headlines stark and sensational, and a stack of photographs held together by a brittle rubber band. She saw a grainy image of a truck at a rest stop, a place she didn't recognize, and quickly looked away, her heart pounding. Her focus had to be singular. She carefully opened the unsealed flap and slid out a sheaf of folded, lined paper. It was a letter. She unfolded it, her eyes scanning the familiar script, the words forming a bridge across 32 years of silence. My dearest Sarah, it began. If you are reading this, then I am gone. And the time has come for you to know the truth about what happened to your family in 1992. I have carried this burden for 32 years, and I pray that you will find it in your heart to forgive an old woman for keeping such a terrible secret for so long. The words hung in the air, each one a hammer blow against the foundation of the life Sarah had always known. The room seemed to tilt, the familiar pattern of the wallpaper swimming before her eyes. The official story, the simple, clean narrative of a family that had simply vanished, was a lie, a carefully constructed fiction. And the person who had written that story, the person who had guarded it with her very life, was the same woman who had raised her, loved her, and protected her. But what? Sarah wondered as a cold fear began to snake around her heart. Had she been protecting her from the truth or the consequences of knowing it? The tears that fell were not just of sorrow, but of a profound, shattering rage. The carefully constructed piece of Sarah's life, a piece her grandmother had paid for with 32 years of silent terror, had been irrevocably broken. The grief in her heart began to cool, solidifying into something harder, colder, and far more dangerous resolve. The question was no longer what had happened to her family, but what she was going to do about it. The shadows her grandmother had feared were long, but shadows retreat when a light is cast upon them. Sarah decided, in that moment, that she would become that light, no matter the cost. Her grandmother had carried the burden to protect a child. Now, it was the woman's turn to carry the torch for justice. Her hands, now steady with a grim purpose, moved past the threatening letter from the law firm. The initial shock had given way to a chilling clarity. This was not just a family tragedy. It was a covered-up execution. She spread the newspaper clippings across the vast wooden table, the yellowed rectangles forming a grim mosaic of loss. This time, she looked beyond the headlines. She began to read the fine print, the names of the reporters, the sheriffs quoted, the towns where the articles were published, with a pen and a notepad from a kitchen drawer. She started to build a new map, not of roads, but of information, of connections, of carefully worded lies. A pattern began to emerge that was even more sinister than a string of disappearances. The official responses were always the same, an unnerving echo across different states and years. No signs of foul play. The investigation is ongoing, but leads are scarce. It's as if they vanished into thin air. It was a chorus of official bewilderment, a coordinated shrug of the shoulders that, when read together, felt less like incompetence and more like a meticulously rehearsed script, tucked away within the clippings. She found a folded, handwritten note from her grandmother to herself. It read, "Sheriff Miller tried. They reassigned him. Said he was too emotionally involved." This small note was a bombshell. It suggested a deliberate obstruction from within law enforcement itself. A particular detail caught her eye in an article from a small Nebraska paper about the missing salesman, a man named Arthur Crane. A local witness, a farmer, had reported seeing a dark green truck from a company called Mountain States Transport parked for hours near the location where the man's car was later found. The witness statement was dismissed in a single sentence as irrelevant, as the company had no official routes or depots in that area. The name pricked at Sarah's memory, an insistent, sharp point. She sifted through the grainy photographs her grandmother had taken, her heart pounding a heavy rhythm against her ribs. And there it was, a blurry image of a truck parked at a desolate rest stop. The same one from the news report, on its side, though faded and distorted by the long-distance lens. The logo was unmistakable, a stylized mountain range above the words, Mountain States Transport. It was a concrete link, a thread of evidence connecting two supposedly unrelated cases separated by 200 miles and 18 months. Elena had seen it. She had connected the dots that law enforcement had either missed or deliberately ignored. In another photo, a man leaned against the truck's grill. His face was mostly shadowed by a baseball cap, but a distinctive tattoo of a coiled serpent was visible on his forearm. He wasn't looking away. He was looking directly at the hidden camera. A faint, knowing smirk on his lips. The image made Sarah feel physically ill, as if the man's gaze could pierce through time and see her sitting there in the kitchen. The pressure in the room seemed to increase, the air growing heavy as Sarah began to understand the true nature of her grandmother's secret life. This was not the work of a grieving woman clinging to hope. This was the cold, methodical work of an investigator, a spy master operating from a quiet kitchen in Iowa. Her hands moved to the hand-drawn map, spreading it out under the kitchen light. The paper was soft, almost like fabric, from being folded and unfolded countless times, cross-referencing the locations of the disappearances from the news articles with the cryptic notes her grandmother had made. She saw the terrifying logic, the marked locations, the barn with the new roof, the broken fence post. The water tower, visible from a specific hill, were not random landmarks. They were waypoints, tactical positions. They corresponded to areas with limited surveillance, spotty cell phone coverage, and easy access to the unmarked back roads that formed a shadow network across the plains. It was a hunter's map, detailing the perfect kill zones along a well-traveled route, designed for ambush and extraction, leaving no witnesses. As her finger traced the path, a wave of nausea rose in her throat. This wasn't just a map, it was a blueprint for slaughter. As she traced the lines with her finger, a sudden, jarring sound made her jump, a scream of outdated technology in the quiet house. The telephone on the wall, an old rotary model Elena had refused to replace, rang with a shrill, piercing cry that shattered the silence. It rarely rang. Most of her grandmother's friends had passed on, and Sarah's friends all used her cell. For a moment, she stared at it, her blood running cold, hesitantly, as if approaching a venomous snake. She lifted the heavy receiver. "Hello?" There was silence on the other end, but it was not an empty silence. It was occupied. She could hear the faint, unmistakable sound of breathing, a slow, steady, and unnervingly calm rhythm. In the background, almost too faint to register, she heard something else, a low, mechanical hum, like heavy machinery operating in a large, empty space. "Hello?" she repeated, her voice sharper this time, laced with an anger she didn't know she possessed. Still nothing, just the sound of that quiet, patient breath and the distant, industrial hum. A cold dread washed over her. It felt like an answer to a question she hadn't yet asked. It felt like a warning. The shadows they chased are long, and they may still be listening. After what felt like an eternity, there was a soft click, and the line went dead. Sarah stood frozen, the receiver still pressed to her ear, the silence of the house now feeling menacing, occupied. She slowly placed the phone back on its cradle, her hand shaking. The phone call changed everything. The investigation was no longer a journey into the past. It was a confrontation with a living, breathing threat. The conspiracy had not died with the passage of time. It had been dormant, waiting, and by opening that box, she had awakened it. A surge of paranoia sent her rushing to the front door, her heart hammering against her ribs. She shot the deadbolt and peered through the peephole. Across the street, under the flickering glow of a streetlight, a dark sedan was parked. She didn't recognize it. It was just a car, she told herself, but in the newfound terror of her world, it felt like a sentinel, an unblinking eye in the darkness. The fear was real, a physical presence in the room, but it was overshadowed by the image of the threatening letter. Its words seared into her memory. They had used her as a shield to silence her grandmother once. She would not let them use fear to silence her now. The sacrifice Eleonina had made demanded more. It demanded action. She looked at the evidence spread before her, the map, the photos, the articles, the letters. It was a powerful arsenal, but it was incomplete. It was the work of one woman, operating in the shadows, to bring it into the light. It needed official validation. It needed the force of the law behind it. There was only one thing to do. With a deep breath that did little to calm the frantic beating of her heart, she picked up her cell phone. Its sleek, modern form, a stark contrast to the decades-old secrets on the table. Her fingers felt clumsy as she dialed the number for the county sheriff's office. Each press of a button felt like a step from which there was no return. When the dispatcher answered with a calm, professional Cedar County sheriff's, Sarah's own voice was a strained whisper. "My name is Sarah Mitchell," she began, the words feeling momentous, irreversible. I have new evidence about a missing persons case from 1992. I think it's time to reopen the investigation into the disappearance of the Mitchell family." The dispatcher's response was not what she expected. There was no request for details, no procedural questions, no hint of skepticism. There was only a brief, loaded pause, a silence that stretched for a few seconds but felt like a lifetime, a void in which Sarah's entire world seemed to hang suspended. Then, the dispatcher's voice returned, calm, measured, and utterly chilling. The tone wasn't just professional, it was flat, devoid of any human inflection, as if reading from a script prepared long ago. "Ma'am, please hold one moment. I'm going to transfer you to Detective Rodriguez." Another pause, this one even more profound, as Sarah tried to process the name. It was unfamiliar, yet spoken with such certainty. Before she could ask who that was, the dispatcher spoke again, her words landing like ice crystals in the warm kitchen air, freezing the very blood in Sarah's veins. She's been waiting for your call for a very long time. The line clicked, connecting Sarah to a new, unknown voice. It was a woman's voice, calm and steady, with an undercurrent of weariness that spoke of long nights and difficult cases. This is Detective Rodriguez. Sarah's own voice was barely a whisper. The dispatcher. She said you were waiting for me. Me? That's right. Miss Mitchell, Rodriguez replied, her tone softening with a hint of empathy. We were. I need you to stay exactly where you are. Don't touch anything else in the box. Don't talk to anyone. Are you alone in the house? Yes, Sarah managed to say, her mind reeling. Good. Lock your doors. I'm on my way. I'm less than 10 minutes out. The line went dead before Sarah could ask another question, leaving her in a silence that was now charged with an almost unbearable mixture of terror and anticipation. She moved through the house like a ghost, checking the locks on the doors and windows, her gaze constantly drawn to the dark sedan still parked across the street. It hadn't moved. Was it a coincidence? Or was she already being watched? The evidence on her kitchen table, once a source of revelation, now felt like a beacon, painting a target on her back. True to her word, a car pulled into the driveway less than 10 minutes later. But it wasn't a standard police cruiser. It was an unmarked black vehicle, the kind that blends into any background. A woman in her late 40s with kind, intelligent eyes and a gentle demeanor that seemed at odds with the situation stepped out. This was Detective Maria Rodriguez. As she approached the porch, her eyes lingered for a moment on the overgrown rose bushes near the steps. Your mother's yellow roses, she said quietly as Sarah opened the door, a statement that was both an offering of peace and a chilling confirmation of how long she had been studying this case. But she was not alone. Two other figures emerged from the vehicle, men in dark suits whose credentials, when presented, identified them as federal agents from a task force Sarah had never heard of. Their presence was both reassuring and deeply ominous. This was no longer a cold case. This was something active, something dangerous. As they settled around the worn wooden table in Elelanina's kitchen, the federal agents remained silent and watchful, their eyes cataloging every detail of the room, every item spread out from the metal box. One agent, a younger man with a severe haircut, seemed particularly tense, his gaze sharp and impatient. Rodriguez, however, focused only on Sarah. Miss Mitchell, she began, her voice gentle but firm. I need you to understand that what you've discovered tonight has implications that go far beyond your family's disappearance. Your grandmother was right to be careful, and you are right to be scared. But you are also right to want answers. And I think, after all this time, we can finally give them to you. What followed was not an interrogation, but a confirmation. As Sarah, with a trembling voice, recounted her discoveries, the clippings, the map, the name, Mountain States Transport, the threatening letter. Even the child's drawing of Emma she had found Rodriguez and the agents didn't express surprise. They listened with a grim, knowing patience. When she finished, one of the agents opened a briefcase and laid out a series of satellite maps and intelligence photos on the table. The effect was staggering. It was her grandmother's investigation, magnified 100 times, rendered with the cold, precise technology of the federal government. There were the same back roads, the same isolated farmhouses, the same pattern of disappearances along Interstate 80 stretching back to the early 1990s. The metal box wasn't new evidence to them. It was the Rosetta Stone, the human element that connected their cold, hard data to a real family, a real tragedy. The younger agent pointed to one of Elelena's notes. The barn with the new roof. We have drone footage of that property from 6 months ago. It shows signs of recent heavy vehicle traffic, but the property has been officially derelict since 1988. Your grandmother was a remarkable woman, Rodriguez said, her voice filled with genuine admiration. She managed to piece together in isolation what a multi-agency task force has been struggling with for years. We have been tracking a sophisticated human trafficking operation that has used these isolated stretches of highway to target vulnerable individuals for decades. The Mitchell family was just one piece of a much larger, much darker puzzle. The air in the kitchen grew cold as the full, horrifying truth was finally unveiled. This was not a confession from a killer, but a revelation from the law itself. And it was more terrible than anything Sarah could have imagined. Your family members weren't random victims. Sarah, Rodriguez continued, her voice heavy with a sympathy that felt achingly real. They were targeted. Your father, David, wasn't just a journalist. He had been investigating deep-seated corruption in the trucking industry for over a year. The man he was scheduled to meet in Denver, a supposed whistleblower from inside Mountain States Transport, also vanished. His car was found in a long-term parking lot at the Denver airport a week after your family disappeared. He never got on a plane. She paused, letting the weight of the words sink in. Your mother, Rebecca, was a social worker. In the months before the trip, she had become concerned about a number of older children who had gone missing from the foster care system shortly after aging out. Specifically, a 17-year-old girl named Maria Sanchez, who she believed was in danger. She started asking questions, making connections that no one else was making, together, without realizing the full extent of what they had found. They had stumbled upon the two ends of this trafficking operation, the transport and the supply. They were about to expose something that very powerful people had spent years building and protecting. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. Her parents hadn't just been innocent victims of a random crime. They had been heroes. They had been murdered because they were trying to expose an unimaginable evil. A modern-day slave trade operating in plain sight on the highways of America. Their dedication to justice had cost them their lives and had torn their family apart. But it also meant their disappearance was not a meaningless void. It was a sacrifice. And the people responsible were not just killers. They were monsters who profited from the most vulnerable souls' runaways, undocumented immigrants, and children with no one to report them missing. One of the federal agents, who had introduced himself only as Agent Thompson, finally spoke, his voice devoid of the warmth in Rodriguez's. Ms. Mitchell, I want you to understand that reopening this investigation puts you at considerable risk. The people responsible for your family's disappearance may no longer be active in trafficking, but they are still alive. They still have fortunes, reputations, and their freedom to lose if this case is solved. The local sheriff your grandmother mentioned in her notes, Sheriff Miller, he was forced into early retirement after a single-car accident that left him with a permanent limp. He was getting too close. They have already killed multiple times to protect their secrets, and they will not hesitate to do so again. Rodriguez shot Thompson a sharp look before turning back to Sarah, her expression softening. That's why we've been waiting. We couldn't officially move on much of this without a catalyst, without a direct link to a victim who could not be dismissed. We were alerted when your grandmother's estate was being processed for sale. We hoped it would lead to you finding what she left behind. Your grandmother understood this. That's why she collected all this evidence but never acted on it herself. The letter she received wasn't just a threat. It was a strategic move by them. They knew she couldn't risk your safety. She was protecting you, Sarah, until you were old enough and strong enough to handle the truth and make the choice for yourself. In that moment, the full weight of her grandmother's love and sacrifice became clear. Elelanina had lived with the agonizing knowledge of what had happened to her family for more than 3 decades, carrying that burden alone, in silence, so that Sarah could have a chance at a normal life. Every deflected question, every sad smile, every moment of quiet remembrance had been an act of fierce, strategic protection. But now, it was Sarah's turn to carry that burden, to make the choice about whether to pursue justice for her family, regardless of the personal cost. She looked at the determined faces around her kitchen table, a room that had transformed from a sanctuary of memory into the front line of a 32-year-old war. There was only one possible answer. "What happens next?" Sarah asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Rodriguez leaned forward, her expression serious but hopeful. The younger agent produced a slim folder. "First, we need you to sign this," he said, his tone flat. "It's a non-disclosure agreement. What you hear from this point on is classified." The formality of the document was another shock, cementing the terrifying reality of her new situation. Rodriguez gently pushed it aside for a moment. "We follow the evidence wherever it leads," she said, redirecting Sarah's attention. "We've been building a case for years, but we've been missing the human element. Someone who can speak for the victims. Someone who can help us piece together what your parents discovered that made them such a threat. With your permission, we'd like to examine everything in that metal box, and we need you to help us." She then slid one of Elelanina's photos across the table, the one of the man with the serpent tattoo, smirking at the camera. "We start," Rodriguez said, her voice now hard as steel. "With him." The forensic analysis of the items in the metal box began immediately, transforming Elelanina's quiet house into an impromptu command center. Every document was scanned, every photograph enhanced, every fingerprint lifted. One of the first discoveries was a partial, unidentified fingerprint on the back of a photograph of Sarah's father, a print that belonged neither to Elelanina nor any known family member. Sarah found herself in a surreal new reality, sitting at her grandmother's kitchen table, which was now covered in laptops and evidence bags, recounting fragmented childhood memories to federal agents. She spoke of her father's late nights in his study, the worried tone in her mother's voice on the phone, the strange new car she saw parked down the street in the weeks before the trip. She recalled a specific memory of finding her mother crying quietly in the laundry room, a memory she had dismissed as a child, but which now felt like a premonition. Each memory, once a soft, hazy watercolor, was now being examined under a harsh, forensic light, becoming a potential piece of a criminal puzzle. The first major break came from the photograph of the man with the serpent tattoo. Facial recognition software cross-referenced with databases of known associates of organized crime yielded a name, Marcus Thorne, a former enforcer for a crime syndicate in Chicago, who had dropped off the grid in 1990. He was a ghost, a professional predator who specialized in making people disappear. Agent Thompson noted that Thorne's name had surfaced once before, in connection with the disappearance of a union organizer in Detroit, but no evidence had ever stuck. His identification was the key that unlocked the first door. Financial records, long dormant, were subpoenaed, revealing a complex web of shell corporations that led, finally, to the parent company of Mountain States Transport. The company was not just a front, it was a ghost entity, with directors who didn't exist and assets that were merely paper trails. But the money it laundered was very real, and it flowed upwards to a name that made even the seasoned federal agents pause, a wealth and reclusive philanthropist, a man who had built a reputation on charity and public service, who was now implicated as the architect of a 30-year reign of terror. Rodriguez found an old magazine article praising the philanthropist for a generous donation he made to a children's hospital in the fall of 1992, just months after he had allegedly orchestrated the murder of the Mitchell family. The collapse was swift and brutal, a series of coordinated, pre-dawn raids across 4 states brought the operational heart of the network to its knees. The barn with the new roof was revealed to be a holding facility. Inside, investigators found crude living quarters and, chillingly, a small, worn teddy bear tucked under a loose floorboard, a silent testament to the children who had passed through that terrible place. Marcus Thorne, the man with the serpent tattoo, was apprehended in a remote cabin in Montana. His smirk gone, replaced by the cold, flat eyes of a cornered animal. The philanthropist, protected by a wall of lawyers, issued denials, but the evidence, meticulously gathered by a grieving grandmother and validated by a federal task force, was overwhelming. The public narrative, once a mystery about a missing family, was violently redefined as one of the largest and longest-running human trafficking cases in American history. The headlines were explosive, a national sensation, with news vans camping out on Maple Street. The satellite dishes pointed at the sky lonely like metallic vultures. But for Sarah, the public spectacle was just noise. Her world was about to collapse on a far more personal, intimate level. Amid the chaos of the unfolding investigation, Detective Rodriguez sat down with Sarah once more at the kitchen table. She laid out a single, enhanced surveillance photograph from the rest stop in Nebraska, taken on the day the Mitchell family vanished. "There's one more piece to this, Sarah," she said gently. "One more person we need to talk about." She pointed to a figure in the background, a woman with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, her posture familiar. The enhancement was crude, but the face was unmistakable. Sarah felt the breath catch in her throat, a gasp of pure, unadulterated disbelief. That's not possible," she whispered. The woman in the photo, the woman present at the scene where her family was stolen from her, was Janet Carver, the kind, patient guidance counselor who had helped a traumatized 6-year-old girl process the loss of her family. Sarah suddenly remembered a specific piece of advice Janet had given her. "Sometimes, sweetie, our minds create scary stories to explain things we don't understand. It's better to focus on the good memories." It was a phrase that had once brought comfort. Now, it felt like a chillingly effective tool of psychological manipulation. The woman who had held her hand dried her tears and assured her that it was okay to be sad. The woman who had been sent to monitor her, to ensure the secret was kept. The betrayal was a physical sensation, a poison that seeped into every memory, twisting every act of kindness into an act of unimaginable cruelty. The entire foundation of her healing, of her survival, had been a lie, orchestrated by the very people who had destroyed her life. The legacy of the Mountain States transport case was a scar carved across the American heartland. Official records state that at least 47 disappearances over 2 decades were conclusively linked to the network. Though investigators believe the true number is likely much higher, the revelations sent shockwaves through dozens of other families, who for years had lived with the torment of not knowing. For them, the news was a double-edged sword, the agony of confirmation, but the cold comfort of an answer. The philanthropist, the mastermind, used his immense wealth to tie up the legal proceedings for years. but was eventually convicted on multiple counts of racketeering and conspiracy, dying in federal prison. Marcus Thorne, the enforcer, accepted a plea deal in exchange for testimony that helped dismantle the network's lower echelons. His confession, a cold, dispassionate account of years of calculated brutality. He never revealed the final resting place of his victims, claiming he couldn't remember the details. They had been, to him, merely cargo. For Sarah, the legal victories were hollow. There was only one piece of justice she needed, accompanied by Rodriguez. She traveled to Missoula, Montana, where Janet Carver was living a quiet life as a respected trauma therapist. The confrontation did not happen in an interrogation room, but in the soothing, gentle environment of Janet's own office. When Sarah walked in, the flicker of recognition in the older woman's eyes was instantaneous. A brief flash of a past she thought she had buried forever. Sarah didn't shout, didn't accuse. She simply placed the enhanced photograph on the table between them. Janet stared at it, her carefully constructed composure crumbling like ancient plaster. The confession that followed was not a scream, but a broken whisper. She had been one of them, a young woman caught in the network herself, who had chosen to become a tool of her captors to survive. Her role was that of the cleaner, the one sent in after the storm to manage the survivors, to ensure their trauma buried any dangerous memories. She admitted to sending monthly reports on Sarah's psychological adjustment to the network, using clinical terms to mask the monstrous nature of her surveillance. She had monitored dozens of children over the years, becoming a twisted sort of mother figure to the orphans she had helped create. She was sentenced to 25 years in prison, not for murder, but for her role in the conspiracy. She never apologized to Sarah. Perhaps she was incapable. The house on Maple Street was eventually sold. The yellow roses still bloom every summer. Sarah Mitchell did not return to her old life. The truth had redefined her. She became an advocate, a voice for the families of the missing, using the inheritance from a grandmother's house to fund a foundation dedicated to solving cold cases. Last year, her foundation's work led to the identification of a Jane Doe who had been found decades earlier. Finally, bringing a name and a measure of peace to another family shattered by a long-held secret. She has answers, but she does not have closure. The bodies of her parents, David and Rebecca, and her sister, Emma, were never found. They remain among the lost, their final moments a secret the vast, silent plains of Nebraska refuse to give up. This is the most haunting legacy of all the knowledge of what happened, but not where. The certainty of the crime, but not the finality of a grave. And so, we are left with a chilling question that echoes in the quiet spaces of history. What is the true nature of justice? Is it the conviction of the guilty, the dismantling of an evil empire? Or is it something more personal, something that can never be found in a courtroom? The story of the Mitchell family serves as a harrowing warning that the greatest monsters do not always lurk in the shadows. Sometimes they stand in the light, cloaked in respectability, their evil hidden behind a gentle voice, a kind smile, or the sterile logo of a legitimate business. It reminds us that the vast, lonely roads that connect us can also be the places where we are most vulnerable, and that sometimes the most terrifying secrets are not buried in a locked box, but are living and breathing just down the street. The truth, once unearthed, can set you free. But it can also reveal that you are standing on the edge of a darkness far deeper than you ever dared to imagine.